I hadn't worn a tie in years. Not because I didn't own one, but because most of the invitations I received didn't require one. Or maybe it's because somewhere along the way I stopped being invited altogether. But that night for my son's 40th birthday, I put on the tie. It didn't fit like it used to. Neither did the world I was stepping back into. The event was held at the Grand Belmont Hotel, the kind of place where the carpets feel like they were woven with money, and the chandeliers never stop watching. David, my son, is a tech CEO. Self-made, they say, though. I remember the nights I stayed up sanding furniture and patching drywall to afford his early tuition. But stories change with time. Tonight, I was simply his father, a guest, and apparently, a joke. The room was overflowing with investors, politicians, startup founders, and press. Everyone was polished, efficient, and practiced in the art of saying everything while meaning nothing. I kept to the back nursing a club soda. I wasn't dressed to impress, just to show I had made the effort. That's when he saw me. David, my son. He was holding court at the center table, his wife on one side, a senator on the other. He raised his glass, paused for a beat, and smiled the way you smile when you know the spotlight is always yours to command. "Well, well, Dad's here," he said, voice amplified by the room's perfect acoustics. Laughter followed, not cruel, just rehearsed. You know, he continued, leaning slightly forward. Most of you know my dad was in the military, fought overseas. He's got stories, maybe too many. A few people chuckled. I managed a small nod. But what most of you don't know, he said, drawing the attention in like a magician preparing a trick, is that he used to sing. No, seriously. My combat vet of a father had a hobby. He sang to his unit. He looked at me, raised an eyebrow, and smirked. A combat veteran singing? What a joke. That line landed like a slap. The laughter was louder now, less rehearsed. My grip tightened around the glass. He kept going. "Go on, Dad. Show them your voice." It wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't even a challenge. It was a command disguised as comedy. Something about the way he said your voice, like it was some relic of a life no longer relevant, something small and quaint. I could have refused. I could have laughed it off, waved a hand, made an excuse. I didn't. Instead, I set the glass down on the marble ledge, straightened my shoulders, and walked toward the small platform where the string quartet had been playing earlier. No one expected that. The chatter softened. Glasses paused mid-air. I didn't ask for a microphone. I didn't ask for silence. I just stood there where the lights hit hardest, and I sang. No piano, no background, just my voice. A single note. Low, steady, full of desert wind and old sorrow. By the second line, the room had frozen. Not because the song was perfect, but because it wasn't. It was raw, worn, true. And when I reached the third line, a chair scraped across the floor. A man stood up. Tall, broad, older, dressed in formal military blues. His hand rose to his brow in a salute. His eyes were wet with tears. "God," he whispered just loud enough, that voice. My son's face froze. So did the senator's. So did mine. But not from shame, from memory. And for the first time in my life, I watched my family wear the silence I had carried for decades. My name is Walter Green, 65 years old, and I have lived most of my life 2 steps outside the spotlight. I never minded that. Some men are made for applause. I was made for keeping people alive. Born in a small town in Missouri, raised by a father who believed silence was the same thing as strength, and a mother who whispered hymns when no one else was listening. I grew up knowing work, not words. When the war came, I volunteered. Not out of patriotism, though I believe in that too. I signed up because the only thing more suffocating than fear is regret. I served in Iraq as a logistics and communication specialist. Not a flashy job. I wasn't in the front lines with a sniper scope or jumping out of helicopters. I was the guy with the maps, the wires, the radios, and a stubborn belief that no voice should be lost in static. Somewhere along the way, my voice started doing more than just transmitting orders. When comms went down and fear crept in, I would hum. Sometimes I'd sing quietly into the headset just to keep the younger guys focused. Breathing with rhythm is a skill we take for granted until the bullets start flying. One night, pinned behind a rocky outpost outside Fallujah, I sang Wayfaring Stranger over the comms. Not loud, not theatrical. Just steady enough to pull one more heartbeat from a soldier who thought he wouldn't see morning. After the war, I didn't talk about it. What we did over there, what we saw, lost endured, wasn't dinner table conversation. So I came home, buried it deep, and built a new life. I worked as an HVAC technician for 30 years. I married a woman named Linda, who had more grace in her fingertips than most people have in their whole lives. We had 2 sons, David and Marcus. Marcus died when he was 8, leukemia. That's a different kind of war, a silent one with no medals. After Linda passed in her 40s, it was just me and David. I did my best. I packed lunches, fixed his bikes, showed up at school events, even when I had oil under my nails. I wasn't perfect, but I was there. That was my version of love presence. David grew up sharp, ambitious, hungry for something I didn't quite understand. He got into Stanford, then launched a company before he turned 30. The boy made good. But somewhere along the way, he stopped introducing me as his father. I became Walter, or worse, a footnote. I wasn't invited to speak at his wedding. At the IPO party, I was seated near the catering staff. And when reporters asked him about family, he spoke about his mentors and formative influences, never once saying the word dad. I never blamed him. Not out loud. Not even to myself. I told myself he lived in a different world now. One where uniforms meant suits, not fatigues. Where respect came with credentials, not scars. I stayed in our old neighborhood in a house that needed more repairs than I had energy for. Retired quietly, fixed broken lawnmowers for neighbors sang in the garage when no one was listening. My voice aged with me. It lost its range but kept its grit. And sometimes late at night I'd sit on the back porch and sing into the dark, like I used to sing into the comms, not to be heard, but to remember I was still here. When the invitation came for David's 40th birthday gala, I hesitated. The card was thick, expensive, with embossed gold lettering. It read like a contract black tie, no guests, valet parking provided. It smelled like distance. Still, I went. Not for him. Not to impress anyone. I went because part of me still wanted to believe that maybe this time he'd see me not as the dusty figure from his past, but as a man worth claiming. I pressed my only suit, polished shoes that hadn't touched a ballroom floor in decades, and arrived on time. Nobody met me at the entrance. I wasn't announced. I walked in like a ghost floating between conversations I wasn't part of. I nodded politely, shook hands with men who measured worth by bank statements, and waited. Waited for a moment that might never come. And then it did, but not in the way I expected. When David lifted his glass and asked me to sing, I knew he thought it would be funny. I saw the gleam in his eye, the same one he used to have as a teenager, when he'd show off in front of his friends by making fun of my old work truck or my thrift store jeans. He didn't think I'd say yes. He didn't think I had it in me, and maybe part of me didn't either. But when I stood up and walked to the center of that room, something inside me realigned. It wasn't pride. It wasn't revenge. It was a quiet, clear voice that said, "You don't need their permission to be real." I opened my mouth. And the rest, the silence, the salute, the stares, none of it was planned. But it was earned. I wasn't always invisible. There was a time back when David was still small enough to ride on my shoulders that I felt like a hero in his eyes. He used to sit in the garage while I tuned up old lawnmowers, asking about what Iraq was like, what it felt like to sleep under the stars with nothing but a rifle in the wind. I'd laugh and say, "It's colder than you'd think." And he'd nod like I'd just handed him a treasure. Back then I thought being a father meant showing up fixing what was broken being a wall to lean on. I didn't understand that children don't always grow up grateful. Sometimes they grow up distant. When Linda was still alive, she used to soften the gap between me and David. She'd translate my silences into love, my rough hands into effort. But when the cancer took her, it also took that bridge. I became the man who forgot birthdays. Because I was working overtime, the man who didn't know how to talk about feelings or scholarships or long-term goals. David started calling me out of touch. He was right in a way. The world he was entering was one I'd never walked. His friends' parents were professors, investors, lawyers. I was a mechanic with war stories and a freezer full of frozen meat from discount drives. I remember his college interview day. He asked me not to come inside the building, said it would send the wrong message. I stood outside in the truck parked across the street and watched through the window as he shook hands with admissions officers. His blazer pressed his smile sharp. When he came back, I told him he did great. He didn't respond, just put in his earbuds. By the time he was 25, David had already raised millions for his startup. I read about it in the paper before he told me himself. The first time I visited his office, the receptionist asked if I was a delivery man. David didn't correct her. He just chuckled and said, "He's family," like it was a technicality. I tried to be understanding. Told myself he was busy, he was building something, he had a lot on his plate. But the little cuts added up. Not being introduced at events, getting his assistant's voicemail when I called, the birthday gift that arrived late unsigned. One year, he mailed me a bottle of wine. I haven't drunk alcohol in 30 years. I remember the worst of it came during his wedding. A beautiful vineyard ceremony in Napa Valley, all white roses and violin quartets. I wasn't asked to walk anyone down the aisle. I wasn't even seated with family. When the speeches started, the best man told stories about David's high school pranks, his college hustle, his mentors in Silicon Valley. No one mentioned me, not once. I sat there in a press suit that didn't fit quite right, smiling at strangers who assumed I was someone's driver. Later that night, when I tried to say congratulations, he said, "Thanks for coming, Walter." That was it. No dad. Just my name. I kept it all inside. Because what else do you do when the people you love rewrite you out of their story? You stay quiet. You let the silence fill the space where the relationship used to be. Marcus would have been different. He was soft in a way David never was. I still remember the way he used to hum to himself sitting in the sunroom, drawing things that didn't exist. He had a gentle spirit. It broke something in me to bury him. After Marcus died, Linda and I grieved differently. She folded inwards, fragile as porcelain. I turned into routine, work, schedules, projects. I didn't know how to talk about loss, so I hammered nails into boards and built things no one asked for. David saw that as detachment, but it wasn't. It was survival. You don't walk out of war and death with the tools to express tenderness. You pick up what you can carry and keep going. Years passed. Our conversations dwindled into updates, tax returns, health check-ins, the occasional holiday card. Still, I showed up, sent texts, called, attended galas, fundraisers, product launches, sat in the back like a shadow. At one such gala, I overheard someone ask David where his father was. He shrugged and said, "Retired somewhere, I guess." I was 10 feet away. I didn't interrupt. That's the thing about being invisible. You learn to stop expecting recognition. My life wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. I fixed heaters for elderly neighbors in winter. I helped widows clean gutters. I still volunteered at the VFW Hall every Friday night collecting stories from men whose names never made the news, but whose sacrifices built this country. And every so often, when the house was too quiet, I'd sit on the porch and hum the tune I used to sing in the canyon, outside Al-Qaim, the one that kept 17 of us breathing while mortars fell like hail. That song wasn't meant to impress anyone. It wasn't perfect, but it steadied the fear. I never recorded it, never performed it, never even sang it for my kids. It wasn't for them. It was for the men who held the line, But all of that was ancient history buried under years of tax forms, lost calls, and polite neglect. That's why when David called me up to sing at his birthday, I knew he wasn't remembering the canyon. He wasn't honoring anything. He was performing control, turning the father he had erased into a punchline. And for a split second, I almost played along. Almost gave them the old man mumble and stumbled back to my seat. But something deep inside me stirred. Not bitterness, not pride, just the quiet dignity of a man who remembered who he used to be, and who realized in that moment that being invisible didn't mean he was voiceless. The ballroom was a testament to wealth, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline. Velvet drapes in deep navy and chandeliers so grand they seemed to hum with their own sense of self-importance. Waiters in white gloves floated through the room with silver trays while guests in tuxedos and gowns laughed too loud at things no one would remember tomorrow. David stood at the center like a conductor, each nod of his head orchestrating conversations, each smirk confirming his role as the man of the hour. When I arrived, no one greeted me. I had RSVP'd, of course. Wrote it carefully on the gilded card, checked the box next to attending, and mailed it with the same hands that once packed MREs under enemy fire. The valet took my truck key with a subtle flinch. Maybe he expected something nicer. Inside, I walked past clusters of guests, none of whom recognized me, and found a small seat near the back. I wasn't surprised. That's where I always ended up, near the exits in the shadows, the place reserved for the obligatory, but unremarkable. My name tag read W. Green. No title, no designation, just letters. I wore my best suit, the same charcoal gray one I'd worn to Linda's funeral, pressed as neatly as I could manage. Around me, conversations buzzed about investments, IPOs, policy changes, and digital transformation. I didn't belong in that room, but I came anyway, because despite everything, he was still my son. I watched as he gave his welcome speech. He thanked his team, his wife, his investors, spoke about vision, about perseverance, and then his tone shifted. "Now I want to take a moment to acknowledge someone special in the room," he said, raising his glass. "Someone who's been through more than most of us could imagine. A real fighter. Someone who used to sing to his platoon, if you can believe it." Laughter rippled through the audience. My stomach tightened. He turned toward me, smile wide. "Ladies and gentlemen, that's right, my dad's here tonight. Walter Green, former soldier, backyard handyman, and apparently a crooner." More laughter. Some polite, some not. My name floated in the air like a balloon losing altitude. I smiled, tight, nodded. Thought that would be it. But then came the line. "Hey, Dad," he called out across the room. "Why don't you come up here and show us what battlefield karaoke sounds like?" A few guests chuckled. One man raised his phone. My heart didn't pound. It slowed. I looked at him, my son, and saw not malice, but something colder amusement. I stood slowly, not out of obedience, but because I knew I had a choice. To shrink again, or to show them that silence is not the same as shame. I didn't say a word. I walked to the center of the room. The crowd parted like I wasn't real. I passed gold cufflinks, sequined dresses, polished shoes. Reached the edge of the small platform where a string quartet had played earlier. The lights caught me head on. I felt every year in my bones. I didn't ask for a microphone. I didn't clear my throat. I just began. The first note wasn't powerful. It wasn't even beautiful. It was worn, cracked with age and dust. But it was true. I sang the same melody I had sung into a failing radio on a moonless night in Iraq. A song to slow heartbeats, to tether men to each other when the world wanted to tear them apart. The laughter stopped. A fork paused mid-air. Glasses hovered forgotten. I kept singing. The room changed. Sound became silence. Eyes widened, jaws shifted. I didn't look at David. I didn't need to. By the second verse, the air in the room had thickened like grief or reverence or both. And then it happened. A chair scraped the marble floor. One guest stood rigid, tall chest broad in a dark dress uniform. His hair was gray, his face lined with memory. He raised his hand in a perfect salute. His voice cut through the stillness. God, that voice. People turned. Someone whispered General, and suddenly recognition rippled across the room like heat. General Carlton, someone breathed. A war hero, decorated, respected. He kept saluting. I lowered my voice into the final note, soft as a prayer, and let it fade. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of shame-awe realization. I looked around slowly and saw their faces. My son's eyes were wide, his mouth slightly open. His wife's fingers were clenched around her wine glass. The senator nearby was standing now, awkward, unsure. No one applauded, not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. The story they thought they were watching a joke at the expense of a relic had changed genres without warning. I stepped back from the light. General Carlton approached me, still saluting, his voice trembling. We heard that voice over a broken line in '03. It held a perimeter when bullets couldn't. It held men together. It held me together. David didn't speak. He didn't move. I walked past him without a word. The room behind me remained silent, and for the first time in years, I wasn't the man they dismissed. I was the one they had overlooked. And they would never overlook me again. The thing about silence is it doesn't always mean absence. Sometimes it's the sound of truth finally taking up space. As I stepped away from the small platform, the final note of the song still lingering somewhere in the room. Like smoke from a slow fire, I could feel the air recalibrating. It wasn't just stillness. It was suspension. Conversations halted not because they'd lost their rhythm, but because everyone present now understood that something irreversible had just happened. I had not given them entertainment. I had delivered a memory too raw to package neatly. General Carlton stood just a few feet away from me, now his eyes glistening. He didn't say more. He didn't need to. His salute had already said everything that needed to be said. I gave him a short nod, the kind you give a man who once shared fear with you in a trench. Then I looked around, slowly. I wanted to see it, to witness it in real time, the recalculation in every guest's expression. The cracks appearing in the polished masks they had worn so easily just moments earlier. A few people shifted uncomfortably, some dropped their eyes. Others looked at David. And David, my son, was standing as still as I had ever seen him. His mouth was slightly open, his glass forgotten in his hand. There was no smirk now, no ironic twist to his posture, just confusion, shock, maybe even shame. But I didn't let that moment be about him. Not yet. I turned and walked back toward my seat at the edge of the room. Each step felt quieter than the last, like I was disappearing again, but not because I was unseen. This time it was reverence, not disregard. As I reached my table, a woman with silver hair and a pearl necklace I recognized from earlier placed a hand gently on my arm. She didn't speak. She just gave me a look, a quiet nod that said, "I saw you." I sat down. The quartet, unsure of whether to resume, fumbled with their instruments, but never played. A man at the far table clapped once, then stopped, realizing it didn't fit. Applause would have cheapened the moment. It wasn't a performance. It was a revelation. The weight of it all settled across the ballroom like dust, soft but impossible to ignore. I sipped what was left in my glass. The taste was bitter, flat. I preferred the silence. Eventually, someone whispered something. A waiter resumed walking. Slowly, the party started to breathe again, but it no longer sparkled. Something had dulled the room's shine. Something had turned the gala into a wake, not for a person, but for a version of truth they had believed in. I didn't look at David again. I didn't need to. I had said everything I came to say without saying a word to him directly, and that perhaps was the loudest thing I had ever done. In that moment, under the watch of chandeliers and men who thought power was a title you inherited, I reclaimed my place. Not with force, not with anger, but with a voice they never expected to matter. And when General Carlton finally sat back down, still watching me, with the eyes of a man who had once heard that same voice in a firefight, I knew the shift was complete. The room didn't see me as a relic anymore. They saw me as the man who had once kept the line from breaking, the man they had almost forgotten, but not anymore. It was the dry season, the kind of heat that curled the edges of paper and made every breath feel like swallowing dust. We were stationed just outside Fallujah, a logistics detail assigned to support a convoy stuck between two supply routes that had gone radio silent. Our unit wasn't meant for frontline engagement, but war doesn't check your job title before it arrives. I remember the night the ambush hit. We were spread too thin, too far from the main outpost, camped near a jagged ridge of sandstone that looked like it had teeth. It started with a single pop, distant, almost like a car backfiring. Then came the crackle of AK rounds, the shudder of explosions, too close to guess direction. And finally, the shouting garbled through radios that were already dying. Comms went dark faster than we expected. Batteries overheated. Frequencies jammed. 1 minute we were preparing rations, the next we were crawling behind overturned crates and ruined Humvees trying to find direction in chaos. Panic isn't loud at first. It sneaks in through the way a man's fingers start to tremble, through the silence that replaces orders, through the eyes that dart too fast to focus. I watched a young private barely out of high school try to load his rifle with shaking hands. Another soldier was muttering prayers into the dirt, like the ground could carry the words back home. I had seen fear before, but this was different. We weren't fighting, we were unraveling. I reached for my radio, twisted the dial, nothing, just static and the high-pitched whine of circuitry giving up. That's when I realized I couldn't fix the tech, but I could do something else, something older than wires, something human. I opened my mouth and sang. I don't remember choosing the song. It came from muscle memory, from the parts of me untouched by training manuals and standard operating procedures. The melody was low familiar. A folk tune my mother used to hum while folding laundry. It had no battle rhythm, no aggressive tempo, but it was steady, measured, real. One line, then another. No lyrics about flags or glory, just notes shaped like breath. At first no one noticed. Then the private with trembling hands looked at me, and then the one praying. A sergeant grunted something that might have been approval. And slowly, subtly, they began to breathe with me. In on 4, out on 4. The rhythm of life when everything else wants to end it. I kept singing. Not because I believed it would change the tide of the battle, but because rhythm gives the body a job. And when the body has a job, fear has less room to move. Minutes passed, maybe more. The shooting slowed. Reinforcements came. We held the line. Not perfectly, not heroically, but we held it. No one died that night. Not a single one. Later I found out General Carlton had been listening. His unit was trying to triangulate our position through the limited comms that still worked. They picked up fragments of my voice through broken frequencies, distorted, but unmistakable. He told me, years later, that it was the only signal they had to go on, that my voice had cut through the noise just enough to lead them to us. I didn't speak much about it after. It felt strange to describe something so private, so instinctive. Singing wasn't part of my training. It wasn't strategy. It was just a sound I made to keep us breathing. But it stayed with me. Not the melody, not the praise. The silence afterward. The way the men looked at me, not like I'd saved them, but like I'd reminded them they were still alive. In war, that's the hardest thing to do. Not to fight, not to win, but to remain human. I never put in for a medal, never brought it up at VA meetings. Some things aren't for records. They're for memory, and mine was clear. That night a voice held the perimeter, not because it was strong, but because it refused to disappear. The morning after the gala, I woke early out of habit. Years in the military will do that to a man. I brewed a pot of coffee, sat by the window of my small house, and waited for the world to catch up. Outside, the sun hadn't yet risen above the trees, and inside, the quiet felt earned. I didn't expect to hear from David, not after the way the night ended. But around 9 a.m., my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. Minutes later, a knock came at the door. I opened it to find him standing there in yesterday's suit tie, loosened eyes, hollow, like he hadn't slept. He didn't say anything at first, just held up his phone where an article was pulled up. Veteran's voice silences tech, gala generals, salute goes viral. A photo of me, mid-note Carlton, in full salute, the crowd frozen in disbelief. The headline was trending. Clips of the moment were all over social media. There was even a hashtag. I didn't need the attention. I didn't want it. But I wasn't ashamed of it either. David stepped inside, walked past me like he didn't know where to stand. He finally turned and asked, "Why didn't you ever tell me?" The words were soft, almost wounded. I looked at him. Tell you what? That I sang to keep people alive. That I held fear off with melody because I didn't have bullets left. He shook his head. No. I mean, yes. All of it. Any of it. I didn't know, Dad. There it was. The word. Dad. It landed like a pebble in a still pond. I motioned for him to sit. He didn't. I thought you just fixed heaters, he said, almost like he was talking to himself. I thought you were just simple. I let the sentence hang. Simple. Like that was something to apologize for. I didn't tell you, I said finally, because you never asked. You built a world where I didn't fit, and I didn't want to force myself into it. He nodded, eyes cast down. I watched the video 10 times this morning, the way the room reacted. General Carlton. He saluted you like a soldier recognizes another, I finished. David paced a little. I mocked you. In front of everyone. I made you into a joke. I didn't let him off the hook. Yes, you did. He winced. I didn't know. I swear. I thought you were holding on to this old soldier identity because you had nothing else. I didn't think it mattered. It did, I said. It still does. He sat down finally, hands clasped. I went home last night and pulled out your old service box, the one you told me not to throw away. I waited. There was a folder in it. He continued with photos, letters, a tape. I played it. The quality was bad, but I heard it. You, singing, in the middle of explosions. The timestamp matched the Fallujah report. I nodded. I saved it. For myself. Why didn't you ever play it for me? He asked. Because it wasn't for applause, I said. It was a moment, not a performance. He looked at me, and for once he didn't have a comeback. No quip. No business metaphor. Just silence. I called General Carlton this morning, he said. That got my attention. He answered on the first ring. Said he's wanted to talk to me for years. Said he's glad he didn't have to be the one to tell me what kind of man you really are. I looked away. Emotions were creeping in slow, sure-footed things I'd spent years keeping at bay. What do I do now? David asked. It wasn't rhetorical. He was asking as a son, not a CEO. I studied him. He was older now, but still mine. Still the boy who used to ask if stars made noise. You don't need to fix it, I said. You just need to know it. He nodded slowly. I want to make it right. I didn't stop him. Didn't tell him it was too late, because it wasn't. Not if he meant it. Not if he understood. Then listen, I said. Listen like you did last night. Not to react, not to respond, just to hear. Because that's the thing about voices. We don't raise them to be loud. We raise them to be heard. That afternoon, David offered to call the press. He wanted to issue a public apology draft, a statement tell the world that he had misjudged his father. "I need to fix this," he said, eyes pleading. "People think I'm a monster." I looked at him for a long moment before answering. "This isn't about the people, David. This is about you and me. You don't fix years of absence with a press release." He flinched, but didn't argue. I could see the headlines already forming behind his eyes. He was still learning how to live without armor. I made coffee for both of us. We sat in silence for a few minutes, just breathing the same air like strangers who'd once shared a name. "What do you want me to do then?" he asked quietly. "You want me to step back? Leave you alone?" I shook my head. "No, I want you to show up. Not as a CEO, not as a son trying to undo a scandal. Just show up. Keep showing up. Let that be the apology." He nodded, slowly. The kind of nod that takes effort when pride is still clinging to your spine. A few days later, he came back. This time not with reporters or stylists or spin doctors, but with an idea. "There's a veterans outreach program in the city," he said. "They've been trying to launch a mentorship initiative, career guidance, emotional support, practical training. It's underfunded, barely functional. I want to fix that. Not under my name. Yours." I raised an eyebrow. "Why mine?" "Because your voice saved men in a war zone," he said. "Mine just sold apps." I didn't respond right away. Instead, I pulled out a drawer and laid a small cassette on the table. "That's the tape you listened to. The one from the Ridge." He nodded. "It's yours now," I said. "If you're going to put my name on anything, make sure you understand what it carries." That night, we sat together and digitized the tape. We cleaned up the audio, cataloged the reports, built a story not for sympathy, but for service. Over the next few weeks, David quietly funded the program. No splashy launch, no PR campaign. He did it the way a man does something when he knows he's late and no longer has the right to arrive loudly. He attended the first workshop, sat in the back, listened. When the veteran spoke, he didn't interrupt. He didn't pitch ideas or offer solutions. He just listened, and I watched. Not for his sake, but for mine. Because choosing grace doesn't mean erasing pain. It means refusing to let it become your only language. One morning he asked if I'd speak at a community event the center was hosting. "You don't have to sing," he said with a small smile. "Just talk." I agreed on one condition. "Don't frame me as a hero," I told him. "That word's too easy." He nodded. At the event, I stood in front of 50 men and women who had worn the same kind of dust on their boots, the same silence in their chests. I didn't give them a speech. I gave them a story. I told them about a young man who mocked his father out of ignorance and a father who chose not to break in return. I told them about breath, about rhythm, about how sometimes keeping one man breathing is enough to make the day count. I ended not with advice, but with a single note, soft, unadorned, the same one from the canyon. A few people closed their eyes. One man stood and saluted. David sat beside me, his hands still, his voice quiet, his presence loud in all the right ways. Afterward, he didn't ask how he did. He didn't ask what came next. He just helped stack chairs, refill coffee, say thank you. He showed up. That was enough. Revenge is a seductive story, but grace is the one that lasts. I could have turned his moment of shame into my triumph. I could have fed the internet its favorite meal, public takedown. But I chose something else. Not because I'm noble, but because I've seen what bitterness does to a man. I've seen what silence costs. And because somewhere buried under layers of ambition and blindness, I still believed my son could become a man worth standing beside, not because of who he thought he was, but because of who he was willing to become. Grace isn't about forgetting. It's about choosing what comes next. I chose to sing. He chose to listen. That's how it begins. 2 months passed before I heard from General Carlton again. He called early in the morning, the kind of hour that makes you think something's wrong. But his voice was calm, even warm. "Walter," he said, "I've submitted your name for national recognition." I didn't respond. It's not a medal, he continued, though you've probably earned more than you ever asked for. It's an invitation. They're holding a remembrance event at Arlington. Quiet, dignified. They want you to speak. About the night you sang. I laughed softly. They want me to speak about something I never thought anyone would hear. They heard it, he said. Now they want to remember it. I said yes. Not because I needed the ceremony, but because I knew there were others who needed to hear a different kind of war story, one where the weapon was a voice and the victory was breath. The event wasn't televised. No cameras, just rows of chairs beneath the open sky, a podium, and silence. Real silence. The kind you earn. I wore my uniform, the one I thought I'd never put on again. It didn't fit perfectly. The seams tugged a little around the shoulders, but I wore it anyway. Not for them. For the men who didn't come home. For the ones who did and carried the weight. I stood before veterans of every era, their families, their scars. And I told them the truth. That bravery doesn't always sound like a battle cry. Sometimes it's a song sung into darkness. Sometimes it's a father standing still while his son laughs. Sometimes it's choosing to speak when silence would be easier. When I finished, no one clapped. They stood, slowly, quietly, as if applause would have broken something sacred. David was in the front row. He didn't wear a suit, just a simple shirt and the look of a man who finally understood what lineage meant. When I stepped down from the podium, he met me halfway. No words, just an embrace. The kind that says everything silence can't. A week later, a small plaque appeared at the community center. It wasn't flashy, just a few lines etched into bronze, in honor of Walter Green. For reminding us that voices can hold the line. I didn't ask for it. But I visited often. Not to admire the plaque, but to sit with the men and women who came through the doors. To listen. To share coffee. To keep breathing. That's all any of us can do. I never became a household name, never chased a spotlight. But that didn't mean I hadn't been seen. I had been. By the right people. In the right moments. And sometimes that's enough. The last time I sang it wasn't in a ballroom or on a battlefield. It was on my back porch, under a sky smeared with stars, to no audience but the wind. I didn't plan it. The night was quiet, the kind of stillness that invites memory in like an old friend. I sat in my usual chair wrapped in a blanket older than my grandson and thought about the journey that had carried me from a forgotten seat at a gala to a name etched in bronze. David called earlier that evening. No agenda, no crisis, just to say goodnight. I found a copy of that song, he said. The one you sang. I play it sometimes when I'm stuck in my head. I smiled, imagining him in some glass-paneled office with his headphones on, listening not to data or strategy, but to breath wrapped in melody. Did I ever tell you what that song's about? I asked. No, he said. And don't ruin it with an explanation. I didn't. Some things lose their power when you name them. I hung up and sat in the quiet, letting it fill the space between my ribs. The kind of quiet that isn't empty, but earned. And then without thinking, I sang. Just the first few lines. Low, cracked, whole. The voice had changed, of course. Age rounds the corners of sound, but the shape was still there. The muscle memory, the intention, the truth. I wasn't singing for a room full of donors or for a general or even for my son. I was singing for me. For the boy I once was. For the soldier I became. For the man who learned too late that silence, when left unchecked, becomes exile. That night I realized something simple. I had spent most of my life waiting. Waiting to be heard. To be seen. To be understood. And when it finally happened, it wasn't because I demanded it. It was because I stood up and spoke when no one expected me to. I sang because it was all I had left to give. And somehow that was enough. There's no grand finale in life. No final curtain drop. Just moments, small and quiet and real, stacked on top of each other, until they form something that resembles meaning. My voice may never reach another battlefield, another gala, another salute, but it will always echo in the places that mattered most, in the breath of men holding the line, in the stillness after the last note fades, in the way my son finally said, "Dad." That is my legacy, not in medals, not in money, but in sound, in silence, in the choice to break both for something true. And if anyone ever asks what kind of man I was, tell them this. I was the kind who sang not to be heard, but to hold. The kind who stood in the fire and offered a tune instead of a weapon. The kind who forgave when revenge was easier. And when the time came, the kind who left one final note drifting into the night, not as a farewell, but as a reminder. You don't need a stage to be seen. Just one moment, just one breath, just one voice willing to rise.